The Watcher. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the dense canopy of trees. Jessica stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the shadows that danced just beyond the clearing. She had heard the stories whispers of a mysterious presence that watched over the woods, legends of hikers who ventured too deep and never returned. But the thrill of adventure coursed through her veins, pulling her forward despite the creeping unease curling in her stomach. Just a little hike, she muttered to herself, gripping her backpack tighter. Nothing to worry about. But as she stepped into the forest, the air grew heavier, a suffocating silence settling around her like a shroud. A chill danced down her spine as the branches above whispered secrets and the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon. This was no ordinary hike, and she was about to discover just how deep the darkness ran into the darkness. The further Jessica walked, the more the forest seemed to come alive, each rustle and crack echoing through the trees. She had expected the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of small animals, but instead there was only a haunting silence, broken occasionally by the sharp snap of a twig underfoot. Okay, this is creepy, she admitted aloud, trying to break the oppressive stillness. Her voice felt small and insignificant against the towering trees that loomed over. She glanced back, half expecting to see something watching her from the shadows, but the path behind her remained empty, with each step deeper into the woods. The air grew colder. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to warn her to turn back. Yet the thrill of exploration kept her going, the lure of the unknown pushing her further into the darkness. Suddenly, she heard a soft, barely perceptible rustle from somewhere in the underbrush. Jessica froze, heart racing, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, a branch snapping, as if something was moving just out of sight. She felt a shiver of fear trickle down her spine, but she dismissed it as her imagination, just a deer or something. She whispered, trying to convince herself, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at her, urging her to leave, to run back to safety. She shook her head, refusing to succumb to fear. After all, she was just a hiker, just someone seeking a little adventure. As she pressed on, the shadows thickened around her, enveloping the forest in a deep twilight. The dim light filtered through the leaves, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Jessica felt the air grow heavy with anticipation, a sense of being watched wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Then she saw a flicker of movement just at the edge of her vision. Jessica spun around, heart pounding, but when she turned, there was nothing there, only the dark trunks of trees and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, and continued along the narrow path. The unsettling presence, the deeper Jessica ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trees twisted overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers grasping for her. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder frequently, convinced that someone or something was trailing her, watching from the shadows. Then it happened again. A shadow darted between the trees, so quick she almost convinced herself it was just a trick of the light. But she felt it, a cold presence pressing down on her, growing stronger with every step. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. Okay, this is getting weird, she said, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. What was she even doing here? She should have heeded the warnings, the local legends of those who had vanished without a trace. Just as she turned to leave, a rustling sound erupted from the bushes nearby. Jessica froze, her heart in her throat. She squinted into the dimness, feeling her pulse quicken as she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man clad in tattered clothing and a mask made from animal hides. His eyes gleamed through the slits in the mask, dark and watchful. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be in these woods after dark." The sight of him set a rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Jessica took a step back, ready to run, but something in the man's posture held her in place. There was an intensity about him, an energy that felt ancient and primal. I'm just hiking," she stammered, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I didn't mean to intrude." The man stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "This forest is not what it seems. You need to leave now." A sudden noise cut through the air, a sharp crack, like thunder in the silence, echoed through the trees. Jessica's heart raced as she glanced around. "Please, just go," he urged, his voice urgent. "They watch you. They want you to stay." The tension builds. Jessica's instincts screamed at her to run, but curiosity held her captive. "Who are you? What do you mean, The Watchers," he replied, glancing around nervously. "They've been here long before you. They feed on fear and despair. You are not the first to be lured here, and you won't be the last if you don't leave." The forest around her seemed to shift, the air thickening with tension. Jessica's heart raced as she took a step back, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of something watching her, lurking just beyond the reach of her flashlight. "I can't just leave without knowing more," she insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. "What happened to the others?" The man hesitated, as if weighing his words. "They became part of the forest. They are the whispers in the wind, the shadows in the trees. You cannot trust what you see. The Watchers will play with your mind until you don't know what's real anymore." Suddenly, a chilling wind whipped through the trees, howling like a banshee. Jessica shivered, glancing around nervously. I need to go back," she said, her resolve faltering. But as she turned, she noticed the shadows shifting again, the forest closing in around her. She could hear faint whispers echoing through the trees, the sound indistinct yet hauntingly familiar. "Help us. Stay with us." "No," she shouted, terror rising in her throat. "I won't stay." The man stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You have to run. They're coming for you." Before she could react, he lunged toward her, pulling her deeper into the woods. Panic surged through her, but there was something desperate in his eyes that made her pause. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "Trust me," he urged, glancing back over his shoulder as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. The chase. They ran together through the dense underbrush, branches snagging at Jessica's clothes, the darkness closing in around them like a suffocating blanket. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep pace with the man, his long legs effortlessly navigating the treacherous terrain. "Where are we going?" she gasped, fear clawing at her throat. "And where but here?" he shouted back. "They'll find you if you don't move." Jessica stumbled, nearly losing her footing as the ground seemed to shift beneath her. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the trees like a chorus of tortured souls. She could feel the Watchers closing in, their presence enveloping her, watching from the shadows. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned just in time to see a figure dart behind a tree. "What was that?" she yelled, panic rising in her chest. "Keep moving," he urged, pulling her forward as the forest darkened around them. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The path was becoming less defined, and the trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches resembling clawed hands reaching for her. Suddenly, she tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground, pain shooting through her ankle. The man turned back, his face a mask of concern. "Get up," he shouted, but the urgency in his voice only heightened her fear. "I can't," she cried, tears streaming down her face as panic overtook her. He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might help her. But then he glanced into the shadows, his eyes widening in terror. "They're coming," he shouted. In that instant, something dark emerged from the trees, a shadow that shifted and writhed, reaching for her with long, clawed fingers. Jessica's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her. "Run," he shouted again, and they took off together, leaving the darkness behind, the revelation. As they fled deeper into the forest, Jessica felt an odd sensation wash over her, the feeling of being watched intensified, an oppressive weight pressing down on her. The man led her through the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but she could feel something chasing them, its presence just behind. "Why are they after me?" she shouted, struggling to keep up. "What do they want?" "They want to keep you," he replied, urgency etched across his face. "They feed on fear, and you're their next meal." Jessica's heart pounded as they stumbled upon a clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the scene. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, overgrown with moss and vines. "This is it," he exclaimed, pointing to the altar. "We need to perform the ritual before it's too late." "What ritual?" she demanded, fear twisting in her gut. "What are you talking about?" "We must appease the Watchers." Jessica's eyes widened as the shadows closed in around them, the whispers growing louder. "How?" she asked, desperation clawing at her throat. "Light a fire," he urged, grabbing her by the shoulders. "We need to draw them away from you." In a daze, she stumbled to the altar, gathering dry leaves and sticks, her hands trembling as she lit the fire. Flames flickered to life, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Suddenly, the shadows recoiled, and she felt the oppressive presence lift, if only slightly. But the moment was fleeting. The shadows slithered closer, drawn to the fire as they writhed and twisted, and Jessica could feel their cold breath against her skin. "What now?" she yelled, panic setting in as the fire flickered and dimmed. "We need to chant," he cried, grabbing her hand and urging her to join him. "Speak the words and they'll be appeased." "What words?" she shouted, the fear overwhelming her. "Anything, just say it," with no other choice. Jessica closed her eyes, focusing on the flames as she began to chant the only thing that came to mind. "I am not afraid. I will not be taken." The shadows writhed, swirling around them, but the fire flickered brighter in response. The whispers grew louder, transforming into a cacophony of angry voices, drowning out her thoughts. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. "Don't stop." The final confrontation. With every ounce of strength, Jessica repeated her mantra, her voice trembling but unwavering. She felt the heat of the fire pushing back against the encroaching shadows, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the watchers were angered by her defiance. Suddenly, the figure of the man in the mask lunged at her and she stumbled back, falling to the ground. "No, get away," she screamed, terror flooding her senses. But then she noticed something. The figure had shifted, revealing its true form. It was no longer the man, but a shadowy amalgamation of twisted faces, each contorted in silent screams, their mouths opening and closing in a desperate plea for release. "Join us," they whispered, their voices merging into a haunting chorus. "You can't escape." Jessica felt the ground tremble beneath her, the shadows reaching out to engulf her. "No, I won't let you take me," she shouted, forcing herself back to her feet. With the fire raging behind her, she chanted louder, pouring every ounce of defiance into her words. "I am not afraid. I will not be taken." The shadows recoiled, shrieking in agony as the flames surged higher, illuminating the clearing in a ghostly light. But the figure advanced, twisting and writhing, its intentions clear. "Foolish girl, you will be ours." With one last desperate surge of energy, Jessica flung her arms wide, summoning every ounce of courage she could muster. "I reject you. I am not yours." The flames roared to life, spiraling into a furious blaze that pushed back against the shadows. The cacophony of screams grew louder, and with a final pulse of energy, the darkness erupted, sent flying back into the depths of the forest. The figure screamed, fading into the darkness as the flames engulfed the altar, purging the shadows from the earth. The scape. As the shadows receded, the whispers began to fade, and a profound silence settled over the clearing. Jessica collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, the weight of terror slowly lifting. "What just happened?" she whispered, trembling. The man, no longer a figure of darkness, stepped forward, his face wary yet relieved. "You did it," he said, voice heavy with exhaustion. "You defeated them, but they won't stay gone forever." Jessica looked around, realizing that the forest had changed. The oppressive presence that had haunted her moments before was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. "But what do we do now?" she asked, her heart still racing. "You must leave this place," he urged. "The Watchers may return, but if you leave now, they will not follow you." With a nod, Jessica turned and ran, her heart pounding as she navigated through the woods. The path seemed clearer now, the shadows less intimidating, as if the forest itself was guiding her home. But as she neared the edge of the trees, a chilling thought struck her. What if the Watchers were truly gone? Just as she broke through the tree line, she glanced back one last time. The forest stood still, but a shadow flitted between the trees, a reminder that darkness lurked just beyond the light. Jessica stumbled into the open, gasping for air as she looked back at the forest. The memory of the Watchers burned in her mind, a chilling reminder of what lurked just out of sight. She knew the legends were true, and she could never return to those woods again. But as she turned to leave, the shadows whispered in the wind, a promise that they would be waiting for her. If you enjoyed this story and want to dive deeper into the realm of horror, check out my channel for more chilling tales just like this one. Stay safe out there, or at least try to.